Thank you for listening to The Luminous Mind, episode 112.
And I said, I want to be a teacher. And he said, why? And I said, because I like working with children. And John replied, oh, Pat, you got it all wrong. If you become a teacher, you're not going to work with children. You're going to work on children.
Benjamin Franklin once said, "Do not curse the darkness, rather light a candle instead." If you're ready to set your mind on fire, then prepare yourself for the Luminous Mind with your host, Rebecca Bowman.
Today's fire starter is Patrick Farenga. Pat brings more than 34 years of fieldwork, advocacy, and personal experience to help parents and children learn their own way. Pat is a writer and education advocate who addresses academic and general audiences about working with children, not on children, to help them learn. Patrick worked closely with one of the founders of the modern homeschool movement, the late author and teacher John Holt, and published Growing Without School magazine from 1985 until it stopped in 2001. Growing Without School magazine was the nation's first periodical about learning without going to school, started by Holt in 1977. Patrick speaks as a homeschooling expert at education conferences around the world, such as in Colombia, Ireland, France, England, Canada, and Italy, as well as on commercial and television talk shows in the United States and abroad. Patrick writes about homeschooling and self-directed learning for a number of publications and operates the John Holt Growing Without School website. He's also the founding member of AlternativeToSchool.com. Patrick's books include The Beginner's Guide to Homeschooling, Teach Your Own, the John Holt Book of Homeschooling, The Legacy of John Holt, a man who genuinely understood, trusted, and respected children, and How to Report Unschooling to School Officials. Patrick has also written chapters about homeschooling in the Encyclopedia Britannica, A Parent's Guide to Homeschooling, Creating Learning Communities, The Handbook of Alternative Education, The Exhausted School, Schooling at Home, and the Encyclopedia of School Administration. Welcome, Patrick.
Thank you, Rebecca.
I am so excited to have him here. I mean, just reading that bio, you can tell he is a well-seasoned expert in homeschooling and thinking outside the box. Do you want to go ahead and tell our audience a little bit more about yourself and then fill in any holes that our bio didn't cover?
Well, yeah, you asked earlier about, some personal details of mine, and I guess two that are important, have always been important to me are music and magic. Ever since I was a kid, I pursued playing the piano. Eventually, my parents gave me lessons, but I used to bang on that piano until they did. And magic, which I discovered through Boys Life magazine when I was in the Cub Scouts. I sent away for a magic catalog. And those have been two hobbies of mine that I continue. I'm 58 now, and I'm still doing them.
That is fun. Yeah.
Yeah. And music was actually a strong bond between John Holt and I. He actually paid for my saxophone lessons. I'd been playing piano since I was about 6 or 7, but I decided in my 20s that I'd like to learn another instrument, and John was so incredibly supportive of it that he paid for my first 10 lessons. And he said, in exchange for that, you have to write an article about it in Growing Without Schooling magazine.
Wow.
So you could go online and look at the back issues of GWS and see my story about picking up the sax when I was in my 20s. Because John, of course, wrote a book about learning to play the cello in his late 50s called Never Too Late. He felt that music is an incredibly important part of his life, and he's always happy to share it, with others.
Wow, that's pretty neat. So give us some background information, kind of how you got to know him and work with him, and then how that helped fuel your own passion and mission.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Well, first of all, I'll give a brief version of it because I write about it in my introduction to Teach Your Own. I talk about how I met him in more detail. But the short story is I was working in a bookstore. I just graduated graduate school. Back then in the early 80s, 1980, 81, they were firing school teachers, not hiring them in New England. It's cyclical. We always forget that, But and all of a sudden, so it was very hard. And I had a master's degree in English, and so I thought I'd be a high school teacher or some sort of teacher. I couldn't find a job anywhere, so I wound up working in a bookstore, like some English majors. As that wore thin, and I was asking, for ideas and help, one of the cashiers there mentioned that her husband volunteered for this author, John Holt, and I could learn word processing if I volunteered and learned how to do that with her husband, Tim. And a word processor was a completely separate machine in those days. It wasn't a program or an app, So it really was a big deal. And I think that the discs only held 45K of information. So it's really amazing when I look back. But anyway, I did that, and I wound up working in the Holt office in the evenings and typing up John's correspondence and whatnot, filling orders. And he was away in Scandinavia at the time. He was doing a 3-month tour, speaking all over. And when he returned, I didn't meet him immediately because, I had this odd volunteer schedule. And so I went up there one night to pack books, and there he was. And so he introduced himself to me. I introduced myself to him. And as I'm packing books, it turns out that John was the most incredible, Ivan Illich was the most incredible reader I ever met. But John was right up there. And he would read 2 or 3 books a day, it seems sometimes. And he was just sitting in the stacks of all our we had a book and music store called John Holt's Book and Music Store in those days. And so he would often get review copies and stuff. And he just liked to sit in the stacks and read. And there he was. So we were talking. And so one thing led to another. We both had an interest in big band jazz. And we wound up humming Harry James solo and Sing, Sing, Sing together. And so we bonded pretty quickly over music. So he asked me, so Pat, obviously you don't want to be packing books all your life. So what do you want to do? And I said, I want to be a teacher. And he said, why? And I said, because I like working with children. And John replied, oh, Pat, you got it all wrong. If you become a teacher, you're not going to work with children. You're going to work on children.
Wow. This was obviously after, you talked about how you were working with the magazine, right?
I was volunteering. I wasn't even deeply involved at that, and I was just learning word processing.
Yeah.
I could care less. It was just a job,
Yeah.
I really wasn't plugged into what he was saying and what he was doing. Because I just thought more school. Frankly, at that point in my life, I was pretty tired of school, and disappointed with my prospects of after getting a master's degree and all that I couldn't even get a job teaching high school. So I was really down on it. And then his thoughts really pushed me back. I was like, what do you mean? Teachers are great people, blah, blah, blah. And he was like, look, have you read any of my books? And I told the truth, no.
Whoops. Yeah.
He said, well, I don't want to argue. I've arrived at this conclusion after many years of teaching and lecturing. Is that I'm not going to argue with you about it unless you read one of my books. So when you do, I'm happy to talk with you about that. And then we changed the topic and moved on and talked about music again. It was a real gentleman, very easy. He didn't hold grudges and stuff. So it was really interesting to me to meet this guy, especially an older person, is that I never, ever had met someone, particularly an academic or ex-academic, who so concisely knocked schools. Wow, and so I picked up his first...
Especially like you said, where he was a reader, really into educating himself.
Oh, constantly, yes. And I think that was one of the reasons why he was able to accept homeschooling so much more than most educators, because he never stopped learning. He never stopped fascinated with possibilities of, what a human can do. After he passed away, we found these little journals where he kept how many reps he was doing with his weights. He was very diligent about keeping track of that and keeping his health and stuff in order. It was very,
wow,
really interesting guy that way. But I wound up reading Teach Your Own, which really had literally come in within the week I started work there. And one of my first jobs was to take the hardcover edition out of the box and put it up on the shelves. And of course, I was just doing that. I wasn't looking at it. So I said, all right, let me read this book first. Well, I couldn't get past the first 10 pages of it. I was just so floored and flabbergasted. How are these kids going to get in college? How are they going to do chemistry in high school? This is crazy. What am I? Who is this guy I'm working for? What's going on? And so when I went in to volunteer again, I mentioned my dilemma to his office manager, who at the time, her name was Peggy Durkee. And Peggy said, yeah, that's kind of hard to get your head around. He says, of course, you've been with John since the 60s. He said, I suggest you just start with his first book, How Children Fail. and see where you go. Because basically everything he writes is just an iteration of that book. And, it's interesting. She has a point. It's very glib. I don't think it's true. But the kernel, his basic theme that fear inhibits learning, and the way we've structured learning in school creates fear. Just does it. And, he spins it out in a million different ways throughout his other art books, I feel. That book made sense to me. How Children Fail, I got. Because for me, I remember coming out of 8th grade, and it was a big decision. What high school did I want to go to? There was a local public high school, the local Catholic high school, and I didn't like either of them. So I talked to my parents, and my dad said, well, there's a really good prep school in the Bronx, not far from where I worked. And he says, if you come in to work with me in the morning, I can take you to that school. So I said, sure. And the thing that got me down about choosing high schools was I remember walking home from school in elementary school in 7th and 8th grade, just saying, I can't, and I was a good student, but I can't stand constantly being told what it is I have to learn. There's nothing to be discovered. Everything just gets handed to me, and then I spit it back. And I remember saying, gosh, I just want to stop this now. 8 years of this, I've had enough. And as if in answer to this prayer, when I went to the open house at Fordham Prep, it was 1974, I think. No, 1970. And they were at the cusp of being an alternative school. And they had come up with the Fordham Prep plan, which allowed high school kids to pick their own course loads and actually act more like a college. And instead of a homeroom teacher, you had a mentor. And every day you'd sit down with your mentor and you'd plan out your schedule. And then you go do those things and then come back at the end of the day and check in with them, make sure you did it. And I just love that. To me, it was heaven for those first few years. But as usual in education, the conservative element of these kids are too happy. There's too much noise. There's too much activity. They aren't learning properly,
Yeah.
And so by the time the senior, the Fordham Prep plan had dissolved, and it pretty much became another preparatory school, which it had been. And so for a brief period, I got to experience an alternative school. And I loved it. And especially, it was run by Jesuits. So it had a very nice high level of discussion among the teens and the adults. And so I really enjoyed that. And then I never had that experience again for the rest of my life.
Like that was the one time I love school.
Right, in a school setting. But outside of school, as John Holt has often written, that has been very important to me. So I was really ripe for meeting John Holt in hindsight. Although at the time, who knew? And like I said, I kind of went kicking and screaming into it because I didn't buy into it right away. And when I look back, after I read How Children Fail, John was actually going to revise that book in 1980. Well, he did revise it in 1983 based on his experiences with homeschoolers. But already back then in 1980-81, he must have been thinking about these things because when we talked about How Children Fail, he was saying, yeah, I may change this. I may say something else about that. And he really wanted to address, I remember, fantasy play. He felt that was something that he couldn't even understand when he was a teacher, because he never saw kids do it in school at the level that they do outside of school. But then when he was working with homeschoolers, he said, he wrote a whole chapter, a wonderful chapter in How Children Learn about fantasy play. And he's talked about, one of the big misconceptions school have is that kids use play to escape from the world. What I've learned is kids use play to get into the world.
Yeah. To fill their role, right?
Yeah, right. Let me try being a cop. In fact, I don't know about you, but when our girls were being homeschooled, unschooled, whatever you want to say, they would play school. They'd never been to school at that point, but they had seen enough television and seen it that, that's how they had to internalize it, through their play in our living room.
With all their stuffed animals or something.
Absolutely. And I've talked to other homeschoolers and they said, sure, their kids have done this too.
Yeah, mine have too. So.
Yeah, right? I mean, it's part of the culture and this is how they get into it. But, so these observations and then seeing that the people that John was writing to and affiliated with and debating with, I really understood the seriousness and depth of what was going on in a way that I never could have earlier on. And I was just very lucky that as I stayed there, I was getting ready to move on because I wasn't getting paid or anything. But fortunately, the magazine was growing so quickly then because he had these 2 appearances on the Donahue show. And they were getting like literally mail bags full of mail. And most of it was positive. There was some hate, but most of it was positive. So I wound up working part-time as his ad manager for Growing Without Schooling. And then when Peggy left, I became his office manager and business manager and assistant publisher, and pretty much wound up taking care of all his personal bills and finances and whatnot. So I got to know him very well.
Wow, that's pretty neat. So, and your own personal, I mean, you kind of talked a little bit about you unschooling your own children. How did that experience come into it too? I mean, obviously, if you're working that close with them, I guess maybe that's just a natural adoption. But as a parent, though, it is different. I mean, it's different talking about it versus actual doing it.
Oh, absolutely. And I also had the unusual background of being a single guy working at Holt Associates. The reason I moved to Boston, I'm from the Bronx, but the reason I moved from Boston to Boston was to be next to my girlfriend, who's now my wife. And so I was working at Holt from 1981 to when did we get married? 1984. And so I was a single guy for those first 3 years. And what was fascinating to me was John had decided to have these open houses once a month. Anyone can come in to meet John and talk with him about just about anything. And I was amazed because, back then, there wasn't this big distinction about homeschooling and unschooling and are you Christian or secular. Anyone who had information that you could use and you wanted a homeschool, you went to them. And so I met preachers, survivalists, cultists, middle class, upper class, professors. All these folks would come to find out about homeschooling in those days. The Wednesday open houses were pretty amazing. And it got a little scary there because sometimes John would be on a speaking tour, like never like 3 months when he was in Scandinavia, but usually a week or two at a time, particularly if he went to the West Coast. And we would, he wanted those open houses to continue whether it was there or not. And that got a little dicey sometimes for me and my colleagues there.
Were people mad that he wasn't there? Is that...
Yeah, right.
Wow.
And with the answer, there we were.
Wow. So you met, how did that paradigm change for you as far as what you thought about people that homeschool? You sound like you met all kinds of people. We hear about the typical homeschooler. It doesn't sound like you really believe there is one with your experience.
Oh, Rebecca, absolutely not. It's kind of like the socialization thing. Here it is 34 years later, and I'm still hearing people say, oh, I get it. I get the academic part completely, but I couldn't homeschool because of the socialization, lack of social. Like, look at my daughters. There are so many kids, who've gone through homeschooling. There's second and third generations of homeschooled children now,
Yeah.
I think we would lay that myth to rest, but that persists. I'm sorry, I kind of lost track of your original question there.
Well, I just, the myth, I think you answered that there really isn't, the typical homeschooler. And I kind of interrupted, how you and your wife came to unschool your own children.
Right. And that was the thing is like, my wife is a feminist and she was working in the theater at the time. So she had no intention of homeschooling children and, and it wasn't on my radar. I wasn't married yet. Kids were just a thought, at best, I was in my 20s, But then after we got married, right around the time John died, my wife got pregnant and with our first child. And that's when we started to talk about it in earnest. I'll never forget one of my in-laws coming after my daughter had been born. She'd been, I don't know, maybe 1 year old at the time. He came to our office on Boylston Street and he was scoffing at me. He was saying, oh, what are you going to do? Homeschool your daughter here? And he points to a corner in the office. And I'll never forget that because you know what? We did. But she never stayed in the corner. She was all over the place. She was in papooses on our back. She was helping pack books. She was drawing while we're on the phone, And again, it wasn't because I originated that. That's because I'd seen so many volunteers, homeschool moms in particular, come in with their children to help out. And I learned from them how you work with children.
Yeah, that it becomes
how you work and the children work.
Yeah. Well, and I have talked with some of my past guests that maybe some of the problems that we have with homeschooling is that, we're trying to have this parent-teacher relationship, whereas really it's really just being not parent-teacher, like a child-student-teacher type of relationship, right. Whereas it's really just an offset. Homeschooling is just an outspring of just your natural relationship that you have with your children. I mean, it sounds like that's what was going on with you.
Oh, absolutely. But again, it takes a while for people, or certainly for me, to realize it. I think, it came quicker to me because I saw so many examples. I mean, these folks coming down on Wednesday nights with their families. And then there's the people the local people who are helping out, getting the issues done, and whatnot. So I really got a feeling of the possibility of that this is not crazy, that, and kids can get into college. Of course, there wasn't a big track record back in the early 80s, but now there is, about getting in there. And our daughter was born. My wife still wasn't convinced. It took about, until about 3 or 4 years old that we decided that we could make it work. And one of the ways, she wound up leaving the theater and doing slide productions, for Data General, a very large computer company that's no longer around. Gone the way of the word processor. But she couldn't bring this child there, and but she could work from home on occasion, so that was working out. But one time I had an interview with NBC TV, and they were coming to the office. There was some court case. They couldn't have Audrey because she was hanging lights and screens and getting everything ready for this big slide presentation. So I took Audrey in to work with me, and there I am dressed in my suit. And but we had set it up so that they would film me from the chest up because Audrey wouldn't let any of my colleagues hold her or anything. She really wanted to. I mean, this was Lauren, not Audrey, my firstborn, and Lauren just wanted to stay. This was obviously with the lights and the cameras and all these weird people and noises, So she was in my lap, and I'm being interviewed. And in the middle of the interview, she threw up on me.
Oh my goodness! That's gonna really, get those parents excited about it.
Exactly, but the guy's name, I don't know. I wonder what happened to him. Peter Fall was his name, and he was lovely. He just said, "No problem, we can edit that out. We'll pick it up again. Go wash up." He was so good.
Well, that's great. Yeah, at least he didn't show this is the bad side of it, right? So.
Oh, no. I mean, and that's what's happening now. I think that there's more of a backlash from the media because homeschooling has gotten bigger and it's more of a threat now.
It's a threat, so, yeah.
And so now you do see these cheap shots all the time, Yeah. Oh, look, he's 10 years old and he doesn't know the 14 times table.
Yeah, exactly. All right. So do you want to tell us a little bit more about your educational advocacy? So you took over, I guess it was growing so big. I mean, kind of go into that. I mean, when he died... Mm-hmm. I mean, was it just there was still work to be done, so you just continued it, or?
Absolutely. We've always, first of all, we're very unusual because we weren't taking money from curriculum suppliers and the conventional sources of money. That's been the biggest struggle about promoting John's work in unschooling is the fact that, if you're telling people to be self-reliant, use the public library and local people. But I truly believe that. And so, that's it. I mean, I remember one time some publisher called up after John died wanting to know if Susanna and I, she was the editor of Growing Without Schooling for many years, 16 years, I think, after John died. And he said, what we want to do is get you and Susanna to go out and argue with public school officials, and then that'll create the buzz to sell the curriculum, the John curriculum. And I was like, no, thank you.
Yeah. Well, and what would be why wouldn't you go out and just argue with them? Is it just because there really isn't a comparison, or what's your take on that?
I didn't want to sell a curriculum. I don't want to. Because John is not... Susanna's found this beautiful quote when she did a collection of John's letters called A Life Worth Living. It was published by Ohio State University Press in 1991. And if you really want to get into John Holt's thinking, that's the book you got to read because it's his personal letters. It's really, and he wrote to some of the most famous people of his time and got in some interesting arguments with them. One of the things that he wrote in there, and it's where she got the title of the book from, was she said he wrote, "A life worth living and work worth doing. That's what I want, not just for children, but for all people, not just something called a better education.
Wow. So just a better life is, yeah.
Yeah, and he couldn't make that, I mean, I've read so many academic papers about the false distinction between living and learning. And John was like, you're the guys making that distinction. You're separating living and learning. A baby doesn't separate it. A parent, who's watching their child learn shouldn't separate it. But because we've been schooled, we do, and we think, oh, that's an academic activity and that's a non-academic. My gosh, you're learning all the time.
Yeah. That's great. Do you want to kind of give us the difference between, I mean, we kind of talked about it before we started recording, but maybe the difference between what unschooling is? I mean, we kind of we're using these words together, unschooling and homeschooling, what the difference is and maybe what your feelings are, what John Holt thought about those differences or...
Sure.
That.
Sure. John wrote a book in 1976 called Instead of Education. Ways to Help Things Better is the subtitle. Ways to Help People Do Things Better is the subtitle. And, at the end of that book, he called for an underground railroad to free children from the destructive forces of compulsory education.
See, this is why I'm surprised you wouldn't want to go out and argue with people.
Oh, no. I argue all the time with them. I get pulled up to do this or right. But, I don't need to sell a curriculum to do that. Just
yeah,
the fact
exactly.
The school. So, I don't need to juice that any more than it is.
Exactly.
And so John he never used the word homeschooling at that time instead of education. And in fact, in the Underachieving School in 1968, he wrote a paragraph in there about how parents, if schools aren't good, should be able to take their children out and teach them themselves. So clearly this idea has always been in his head, but, he never fully developed it and expressed it. And then when he did, he didn't like the word homeschooling because it gives the idea that everything has to take place at home and it has to look like school. So right from the get-go, he came up with the phrase unschooling in 1977. But I've got to point out that even then, in Growing Without Schooling number 1, I think it is, or issue 2, he defines unschooling, as a political phrase, and homeschooling is when we're talking to parents. And then in the book, Teach Your Own, which he wrote in 1980, he gave up on that distinction after 3 years, of trying to. And in fact, even in the pages of GWS, you can see it where he uses unschooling, then he uses homeschooling and unschooling. That just becomes homeschooling. And in Teach Your Own, if you look up the word unschooling in the index, it says see homeschooling. I mean, he realized that it was kind of a losing battle and it was just adding more confusion than light to the issue. But by unschooling, John meant quite simply learning that doesn't have to take place at home and doesn't have to look like school. And nowadays it's like I can't tell you how many interviews I do when people, among unschoolers and homeschoolers, and they say, okay, so what's your definition of unschooling? As if if everyone brings their own definition, it doesn't have a definition, I feel.
Yeah, exactly.
And that's so much easier to say homeschooling, and then I lead into the unschooling or self-directed learning, which people seem to have it's a little more informative to people if you use those words.
Yeah. Well, and if you've homeschooled your kids for very long, you do realize, like I did, like several, a year or so in, that after I got done teaching them, in the traditional sense of the schooling, that they went off and some of the things that they did on their own was way more in depth and just, they blew my mind, the things that they did. And so yeah, there are a lot of people that try to differentiate. And I know there are people who just do unschooling and they let their kids just learn whatever and they don't maybe guide it. Is that... Maybe that's a stereotype.
I don't think it's fair to say they don't guide it. If they're serious about it, and their children have an interest, they're going to feed that interest. That requires guidance and often finding other people to help out. For instance, I don't know anything about criminal justice, and I don't care other than what I see on Law and Order. But I care. I'm being glib there. But, my oldest daughter wanted to study it. And so, like many homeschoolers, she was able to use a community college at an age when she was 14,
wow.
when other kids were still in high school, And so she started to take a course in criminal justice and she loved it. She wound up taking another one. That's guiding. But did I teach her? No.
Yeah.
So, you know, I mean, it's like right now we're having this big debate in this other organization. I'm a co-founder of alternativestoschool.com. I founded that with Dr. Peter Gray for other people. And now it's growing and catching on. And we're wondering about, kind of like with growing without schooling. Like everyone kept saying, yeah, I get the idea, but why does it have to be so negative about school? You know, without, you know. And so everyone takes offense at that. So we're like, and then even saying alternatives to school turns people, oh, you're so negative about school. You know?
Yeah. Why do you hate school so much?
Yeah. It's like, no, my kids actually have gone in and out of school and have gone to the community college. I mean, you know, but it's a matter of choosing it, not being forced.
Yeah. The difference between having a bureaucrat tell them what they need to learn versus them, you know, right? Is that what
Precisely. Precisely. Yeah. And we all know the other issue is that our kids, if they don't get along with the teacher, if the class doesn't suit their needs, or sometimes happens the class is above them, right?
Yeah.
They can drop it. It's not like in school where you can't. You got to go through the whole semester.
Yeah. You have to do the drudgery.
Yeah. So it's much more realistic and more real life, more like college, if you will. But I don't see college as the primary goal of education anyway. And so I really feel that the goal of school shouldn't be more school, I feel.
Like you're talking about before, leading a better life, maybe. Something.
Exactly. Yeah. And what we're seeing today is just like, you know, this whole idea that you're going to go to school and become a lawyer, go to school and become an accountant. Well, there are more lawyers than we could shake sticks at. And accounting is always a great occupation, I guess, but I don't know what the prospects are for them. But do you really need 4 years of college? I know some people who are excellent bookkeepers, but because they didn't go to college or get a CPA, they can't be called an accountant, you know? So it's interesting how, you know, John just sort of opened my mind to see, like, there's all these other possibilities.
Before we go on, let us take a minute and hear about our sponsors.
Hi, my name is Patrick Farenga, and I've been involved in homeschooling since 1981, when I joined John Holt to further his work with Growing Without Schooling magazine. I learned from John that homeschooling can be a flexible, vibrant, and social way to learn without turning your home into a miniature school. Starting to Homeschool is a series of webinars, written materials, and online support that shows you how to use homeschooling to help you and your family learn in your own ways. As a special offer to Luminous Mind listeners, you will receive a 10% discount off the regular price for the webinars by entering this code at the checkout screen. Just enter Rebecca, all in caps, REBECCA. Thanks, and I hope to meet you online at the Starting to Homeschool website soon.
Welcome back to the Luminous Mind with Patrick Farenga.
That's where I'm at now, is I get self-directed learning, and so the debate that we're facing now is like, we want to call it self-directed education, because it's an even bigger phrase and concept, and leads to the idea that it's not just like individual, do your own thing and with tutors, that this is also like, you know, we're talking about changing education. It's not just going to be this incremental, like, you know, thing. And there's a lot of issues. I mean, it's taken me a while to get my head around it, because schooling is not the same as education, and education is not the same as learning. I mean, education's just become a checklist in most people's minds to get a job. That's not what we're talking about. But again, just like with the word unschooling, I mean, I've been at it 34 years and it hasn't caught on. So, you know, I think it tells you something, you know? I mean, it's caught on with the niche of people who become, you know, ardent practitioners. But, you know, to try and describe it as we're doing, it gets hard, you know? So we fall back on homeschooling. And then, you know, self-directed education, it might make more sense than self-directed learning in terms of trying to change the paradigm, because I think that's what interests me now. And I mean, I love and always am fascinated with how individuals learn in family and communal settings and on their own. But I've published over 5,000 pages of information on that in Growing Without Schooling. And now that my daughters are 29, 24, and 22, actually 22 years, I'm going to be 23 tomorrow, I really feel that this is time to broaden this. And John was thinking that. I mean, he was trying to, too. but his life was cut short, and we'll never know what was there. But I do have an unpublished manuscript of his that I've been working on with a friend of mine, Akshay Ahuja. And Akshay has done a wonderful job of stitching together some unpublished speeches of his and these fragments of a book. And the whole thing is about strategies for survival is what we're calling it right now. It's our working title, because it's all advice to the young about how to get along in a world that's crazy. And he wrote it in the early 70s. So he's talking about police brutality against hippies and blacks. And he's talking about schools increasing reliance on standards and high expectations, enforcing, and college becoming the credentialing institution for jobs.
Wow. And sounds like he was ahead of his time in a way, because it's just gotten it's out.
But Rebecca, he wasn't the only one. You asked about other mentors, and for me, other influences were Ivan Illich, who was a deep influence on Holt. It was Illich's book, Deschooling Society, that gave John the idea that maybe we don't need schools in order to, for this whole thing to work. Maybe they get more in the way than help. So Ivan...
And frustrate people.
That's right. And Ivan's work is, again, it's not deschooling education. It was deschooling society. He always had this much broader vision about what's going on. And we all know that, if you spend 12, 16 years in a place, 8 hours a day or more, it's going to have an influence on you. Let's face it. And this idea that school is preparing us for life, well, as Illich called it in 1971, the hidden curriculum of school teaches you a lot. And as blacks and many of the other minorities in school, like special ed kids, have realized, is that, once you get labeled by school, it's hard to get unlabeled.
Yeah, exactly. That follows you almost the rest of your life. Mm-hmm. So yeah, I would love to hear more about basically what your challenges have been. We're talking about decades of trying to get this philosophy or, changing this paradigm. Tell me about some of those obstacles and then maybe some successes that you've seen. Are we getting closer to a society that is a little bit more unschooled, or what have you seen over the years?
Well, I really do feel that things are incrementally getting better for homeschoolers and unschoolers, because our numbers have increased. There's certainly more services out there. And the whole communications, we all say the internet, but it's just communications in general. Even television is providing more so-called educational content. But we're all realizing that that's kind of a shell game too, that just because a game says it's educational doesn't really mean it's a good game or that it really teaches anyone anything. Whereas games like Tetris or Grand Theft Auto or Call of Duty that our kids will play till their eyes fall out and we think are not educational actually have deep lessons. There's a wonderful video called How World of Warcraft Saved My Life by Eric Martin. You can look that up on YouTube. It's a TEDx talk that this young man did. Very eye-opening about, you just think it's about, strategy and tactics and blowing people up. Listen to how these young people get involved in these massive multiplayer games and stuff. And it's highly educational and much more social than I think most people realize when they think about computer gamers.
Yeah, sometimes I'm like telling my kids, get off of that. You need some outside, less screen time or whatever. So,
right.
Yeah.
Right. Oh, well, I remember my parents yelling at me, "Oh, you got to go out. You're playing the piano too much. Get some fresh air." And then, don't read in dim light. It'll make you blind. Because I love to read too, but they didn't like me to read at night after a certain time. And of course, I always snuck a flashlight in. Into the cupboard. But again, in hindsight, there's no truth to that. You don't go blind by reading in dim light, with at least a flashlight under a cover, and frankly, if I'd been allowed to play the piano as much as I wanted, who knows? That 10,000 hours of practice could have sent me into the Boston Symphony Orchestra instead of John. And this is the hard thing that we have as parents, to go back earlier, my wife comes from a military family and she didn't read the whole time I was working at Holt for the first 3 years. She never read any of his stuff. And she met him a few times. She had him over for dinner and stuff and she loved him very much. But, she could care less one way or another.
What his philosophy was.
Exactly. And then once we had children and, we started to talk about it, she slowly came around. But it was very slow. It was very conventional, and being from the military, the idea of a child saying no and you having to respect that, that's that was very hard. And that's why I have an open heart towards everybody who's homeschooling and unschooling, because it's a journey for the parent too.
Oh, yeah.
Everybody thinks, oh, you're screwing up. You're making all these mistakes. You're not a true unschooler, whatever. You're not a true homeschooler because you're not using the such and such curriculum. Get off of it.
Yeah.
Everyone is different, and every family's got to cope with these things as best they can. And hopefully, if you're kind and open and generous with your thoughts and heart, people will ask you for help, and maybe you can help them. And if not, maybe you can direct them to someone who can. But just to shut the whole conversation down by saying, oh, you're not Christian enough, can't help you.
Yeah. Yeah. So do you feel like maybe that's some of the obstacles that we have now, is that as homeschoolers, we've done that?
I think so.
I mean, you were talking about in the early days, like it didn't matter. I mean, everyone was so excited to meet somebody else that was doing something, unconventional. You were meeting with, a plethora of different types of people, and now we have segregated ourselves a little more.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, once Homeschool Legal Defense Association came on the picture, they pretty much started to draw a line between secular and religious homeschoolers, and they wouldn't take any of the arguments. In fact, when it comes to unschooling, sure, their positions have changed. But back then, it's like, they would just dress the kid up in a suit and the family and present them as, prep schoolers, and try and disguise it. They just didn't get it.
Uh-huh.
But I think, first of all, the numbers have increased overall, and the proof is in the pudding. A lot of homeschoolers have had the experience you've had, whereas you start off doing school at home, but then over time, you don't want to say unschooling because, oh my gosh, that's that liberal John Holt. You don't want to say that. So we'll be eclectic. I mean, honestly, the parents pick and choose, fine, all right? But, I think you should do it in conjunction with your children. I mean, what's the point in spending $1,000 on a product if your kids don't like it in the first place?
Exactly.
So, sit down and involve them. And how else are kids going to get good at learning to make good choices in their lives? Unless they start to make choices and learn from their mistakes.
Yeah.
So, some people would say that, unschoolers push them maybe too quickly into that. But, sitting down to see what reader you want for your first grader or your third grader, what math curriculum for a high schooler. I mean, if you can't sit down with your child and talk about that, come on.
Yeah. Well, and there is some value to, like you said, children making choices. We see far too many kids that get out in the world, and when they finally do have a chance to make choices, they're like disastrous, and at least it's in a nice, comfortable area where we allow them to mess up, and, there's no harm. There's no, we just move on. But to not let them make choices and then all of a sudden... turn them out into adulthood is a little scary.
Dr. Peter Gray, I think it was last week or the week before, in his latest Psychology Today blog, talked about this crisis of resilience among college students. How, counselors and teachers are all noting that college students are breaking down in record numbers over bad grades, failed relationships, and so on. It's like they don't recall seeing this amount of breakdown.
Yeah. Well, maybe if they can't do it perfectly, I mean, like we said, when they're young and we're letting them make mistakes and stuff, and they see, oh, I make mistakes, it's okay, I can correct it and, move on. But when all of a sudden they're making the choices and it's not going perfectly, it could be, wow.
Right, and Peter actually does distinguish unschoolers and homeschoolers and cites research that shows that, they do very well. They are very resilient in college in comparison, and that's because I had to face adversity perhaps in academics and whatnot at earlier ages and dealt with it in a productive way, in a growth mindset, to use the current phrase.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. Well, and the whole idea of grades, I think sometimes that can be destructive too. If they're not pulling a straight A, sometimes they feel like they failed versus like, well, what did you really get out of that? I think homeschoolers, because there's no really grade, they don't care. They just are enjoying it.
That's right. It's like if you love music, the reward for understanding how to make your fingers move in a certain pattern so you can play Moonlight Sonata, and you finally get it. The reward, for someone who really loves music isn't a gold star. I mean, it might be nice to get a pat on the back from your teacher or a smile, and certainly you see the pleasure of an audience listening to you. But the reward is to be able to play it and then to move on to the next thing. Now I get to do the epithétique. I can learn that. We corrupt it. And Alfie Kohn, in his book Punished by Rewards, sums it up very well about all the problems. And we have so many people who say, oh, if you don't have grades, schools are useless. They'll fall apart. When John Holt taught at Harvard in the late 60s for a semester, and he only offered the course pass-fail. He refused to give grades. And many of the students walked out on the first day when they found that out, because if they couldn't get an A on their report card, they couldn't care less about Mr. Holt's ideas.
Although what employer asks what, your GPA was? Well, they don't care.
Right? But the other thing is, we're not at this competitive level, too. Like Harvard and all the Ivy Leagues and stuff. It is another environment. You're hanging out with people who super wealthy, and you may not be because you're there on a scholarship. As I know, like homeschoolers who go to Harvard, some of them have had a tough time. They've been unfairly categorized and stuff. In fact, there's a support group, I don't know, still there, called Homeschoolers Anonymous at Harvard.
Oh, wow. Well, tell us, you talked a little bit about the manuscript that you're working on. Is there anything else that you're currently doing? I mean, I went through... Your bio was just filled with, you've been on the Today Show. I was shocked too, conferences all over the world, which, as a podcaster, I've seen that. I've seen people checking in France and Germany and some of these places where you're like, what? They care about homeschooling there? But tell us some of the things that maybe you're doing now that you're most excited about.
Well, one of the big projects that, is really close to completion is called Starting to Homeschool with Pat Farenga. My friend Steve Hargadon, who runs the learningrevolution.com, suggested this to me. And we decided what we would do is, so many people get started with homeschooling, or want to get started, but they don't have like all the information or a whole overview of what homeschooling is. And since, I've written about it, I published, but what I realized is that this is the video age now, it's the YouTube age. So we made 6 one-hour talks by me, each on another subject about starting to homeschool. And they were free for the day that I did them for 24 hours. And now we're packaging them, and all the handouts and the capstone to the whole package is that book, How to Report Unschooling to School Officials. Because, in homeschooling, you're going to have some conventional things to show a school person if you have to report to them. Not everybody does. So it's important to remember. Make sure you have to report before you file a report. But if you do, and you're doing school at home, you're going to have a curriculum that you either purchased or that you've written out, and you're going to have goals, you're going to have worksheets, you're going to have tests, classes taken, time spent on tasks. You have all the conventional things that schools are used to seeing. But as an unschooler, if your child is learning to read yet and they're in 3rd grade, but, oh boy, do they love to play with Legos,
Yeah.
What do I do? Well, I tell you how to present this, because there are schools, and this is the insight that John had many, many years ago. If I sent my kid to an alternative school and paid $10,000 a year or whatever it is, tuition for them, so they could do whatever they want, why can't that happen in a home? Especially since he knew that those teachers were uncertified, and certification is not necessary for school. Or, well, I won't say for school, because I think school has become such a bureaucratic morass that's what you got to learn, are the bureaucratic ropes.
Yeah. Well, and that certification, I guess that's kind of what makes me laugh, is that, sometimes you're getting permission, and we talked about how, having to go through that schooling process kind of shuts some people out of things, of things that they really want to do, because they can't meet that, whoever the bureaucrat is, they can't meet their idea of like, you're the professional, you understand what you're talking about. It's kind of like we, not long ago, we put in a septic tank in our house, and, we go to the government bureaucrat that tells us how to put it in, and it ended up failing on us two years after. And then they wanted us to come back and get a permit. And we're like, well, you're the ones who messed up. And so, but basically, getting that certification, what does that really mean to us sometimes anyway? Who's the certifier? Who's to say who's the one that really knows how something works?
In the few studies that have been done, but there have been some of homeschoolers who are certified teachers, because there are a fair number of them. They see what's going on in the schools. I'm not going to put my kids in there.
Exactly.
But they were able to compare them. And what they found out is using standardized test scores and nothing else. The homeschoolers who were certified teachers, their children did score higher on standardized tests for the first 2 years or so. But within the first 2 or 3 years, the other group of parents, their children came up. And if they don't know why, did the parents get better at it? That's probably part of it. Did the children learn and get better at it? That's certainly part of it too. So, it's this whole thing of this incredible rush, that school is. Run, School, Run was the name of a book that I think Roland Barthes, maybe published, or John Barthes, I forget. And in it, I remember there was this passage about how John said, where he berates John Holt, saying, John Holt thinks that children should learn to read the way that they learn to ride a bicycle, with a parent holding the back of it to give them support and then periodically letting go to see how far they can get on their own. He says, who has time for this nonsense? Run, school, run. We've got things to do. It's just like, that's the school mindset. Not all schools are that way, but we know the majority are. And the pressure is so strong right now, it's gotten ridiculous.
Yeah. Well, and everyone feels it. The parents with their homework and the students with their homework. Like you said, the competition or just the expectations are it's creating a lot of anxiety and depression and stuff for children trapped in that cycle. So what advice or encouragement would you give to, someone who wants to homeschool, or maybe someone who's starting out, another teacher, maybe parents, students?
I would say the most important thing that you can do for your child is to maintain and strengthen your relationship with them.
Oh, that's interesting.
Sharing your life with them, your concerns as much as you can. And that to me is far more important, because I have seen kids whose parents send them to school, and homeschoolers, even some unschoolers. I've seen them sacrifice their relationship with their children on the altar of education.
Yeah.
And that's crazy. Why, if you're schooling at home, ruin your relationship because they're not getting algebra?
Yeah. One of my other contributors actually talked about this, that they see the parents push and push and push so much that they finally, when they're free, they flee everything. They flee their family and stuff, which is extremely sad when you've had all that time to work with your kids.
Well, that's absolutely right. And, and again, this is not news, in the early issues of GWS, you could see letters to that effect where parents are talking about that. But we can't, everyone has to learn it themselves. It's not something we could all broadcast once and get.
Yeah. Well, and part of that might come from the fact, like we talked about, or you talked about earlier, that it's almost harder for the parent, to go through homeschooling, especially if you've been in the traditional school, to go and all of a sudden, because you're trying to pattern that, your educational experience, your children's educational experience after what you experienced yourself. And then we are fearful of what other people might think of us. Would you agree with that? That maybe that might fuel the destroying that relationship?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Because, a lot of parents live vicariously through their children.
Yeah.
And, that's dangerous because you're not treating them as individuals who may be different than you.
Exactly.
Because very often it's like, why did you do that? I wouldn't have done that. Well, think about that for a second. You're not them.
Exactly.
And that was the thing, like this ability to put yourself in someone else's shoes and to understand it. That was one of the great gifts that John had, when he writes about how children learn, because he talks about his mistakes as a teacher. And how he started off as like this highly conventional, highly structured, tough grader. And over time, he realized that the more he let up on that, the higher the kids' grades got and the more interesting and wide-ranging their conversations became. And of course, he got fired from every job that he did that in. He worked in nothing but private schools, but they fired him for doing it. But based on his work in those private schools, How Children Learn and How Children Fail was created, and they led to his career of the John Holt that we know. Although his first book, How Children Fail, I think was rejected 11 times before it got published.
Wow.
So take hope, all you would-be authors.
Yeah. Well, and it sounds like he was just a man who didn't give up, regardless. Yes. I mean, he was spouting a message that the world thought he was a little bit crazy.
Oh, yeah.
So.
Well, in the legacy of John Holt, I interviewed and asked people who knew John personally to write about, John. And that was, to me, one of the most interesting things was, when he was in the mid-70s, he would go on a lot of camping trips with his friends, the Talbots. Oh, gosh, I can't remember his name now, but he's not a Talbot. He's a friend who was there. He's actually the head of the National Weather Service now. I can't remember his name now. Anyway, he and John were going up the hill behind the Talbots. And he said John was like having a chess match in his head over whether he should support homeschooling or not, like running through all the pros and cons. And that was years before he had written the first issue of growing out schooling.
Maybe fearful of what people would think. He kind of agreed with it. I mean, how many of us as homeschoolers, we want to homeschool, we want to do that, but we're just scared of how we're going to be accepted in society.
That's right. And I know that a lot of unschoolers or homeschoolers will say, "Oh, I could give a damn what other people think of me,"
Oh, it's always there.
I know. I mean, but what about your children? Not every child has that outspoken personality either, and they're the ones that are internalizing this on. So it's a very complicated issue that I think that we advocates, certainly, sometimes gloss over, and also that our critics just don't appreciate. I think that, they don't realize that, in a sense, we are a minority. That, it's kind of cool that our kids can ride bicycles in the school playground while the other kids are in school. But we don't want to tweak the officials here, beard the lion in their den, so to speak. And so I would advise against doing that. Take them to the park to ride the bike.
I'm just imagining the kids looking outside the window.
and that's a true story. I have a friend who did that. So, and the kids were looking out the window, waving at her son, and getting in trouble for doing so.
That is hilarious. So, well, before we say goodbye, do you have any final parting words, basically, that you'd like to share? And then give us your contact information, how we can get your books and, get in touch with you.
Well, I feel like my advice earlier about, not sacrificing a relationship on the altar of education is sort of like a tagline in my mind for me. So that's about it for witty sayings at the moment. But if you want to find out more about me and my work, I write a blog at www.johnholtgws.com. I have a YouTube channel, Growing Without Schooling channel, and it's also on my website. I have a lot of videos, not just of John Holt, but conferences. I've put on 2 online conferences called the Homeschool Conference. And we have recordings of the presentations there, all from all around the world, homeschooling in Romania, homeschooling in the UK, as well as, of course, all around the North America. You can find my books at Amazon.com. My self-published ones are The Legacy of John Holt and How to Report Unschooling to School Officials. All the other books are published by major publishers and are available also at Amazon, but at your local bookstore or library. So I hope that you'll pick up something by John Holt and be intrigued.
Yeah, well, I've been super inspired. I really appreciate your time, Patrick. It's been just a treat for me to have you on our podcast.
Well, thank you, Rebecca. It's been a pleasure on my part, too.
Thank you for listening to The Luminous Mind. To learn more about Patrick Farenga, go to our show notes at theluminousmind.net. Be sure to become a subscriber to our free email list and consider joining our program by going to the scheduling tab to become a fire starter today. Help support the podcast by making all your Amazon purchases through the free Amazon widget on our website. Also, sign up to receive 2 free audiobooks from Audible at theluminousmind.net. Like us on Facebook, follow us on Twitter, Google+, and now Pinterest. Get our audio content by subscribing on YouTube, iTunes, and Stitcher. To help us grow, consider telling your friends about us. Leave us a review. Tell us how we can help you so together we can continue to light minds on fire and change the paradigm of education.